These past few weeks have been absolutely peak for superhero fans because we have been getting fed with content. However, sadly this week one of these shows has ended its 4th season, though don't worry, there's a 5th one coming. And I have some thoughts on this season which some might consider controversial. It's another year and therefore Mark is being tested once again to see if he truly is There will be huge spoilers in this video, so come back after having watched it. After getting his butt kicked by Conquest, Mark had vowed that he would slime anyone who causes problems for his family and friends. And so Mark does sliming. First up, he fights the urge to absolutely slime Dinosaurus for simply causing chaos as a dinosaur. Though he's more like the Hulk, so when he switched back to the human form he wasn't as much trouble. Even then Mark still considered it. Everyone else is also just going about their day dealing with superhero issues, and Oliver is now a grown teenager. The Guardians of the Globe reformed just in case, but Robot is no longer the leader due to him rebelling against Cecil last season, and Eve's powers also start acting up, and we will find out why later. Then we have a double threat this episode. Invincible Inc., the company Mark and Eve started to do freelance superhero work, deal with Universal whilst those bloody Sequids return. Eve and Mark kinda deal with Universal quite quickly, and then Cecil gets Mark to fight the Sequids, but Mark puts an end to this once and for all by sliming Russ Livingston, ending the Sequid saga for good. Please end it. I don't like seeing them, please. And also Conquest lives. This is a pretty decent start to the season, there is a lot of stuff in this compared to the other season openers, but there isn't much to talk about it because this did drop with episode 2 and 3 at the same time, so when watching it you kinda get a whole lot of stuff. Now overall there isn't much to talk about this episode besides Mark's tendency to just slime everyone who causes any harm to Earth or to his family and friends. And it's quite an interesting dynamic because we've never seen Mark like this, and usually when a hero has a no kill rule they usually stick to it. That's literally the entire plot of Daredevil Born Again season 2. He could just, slime Kingpin and stop everything, but he doesn't and he refuses to do it. However here Mark is making that decision and we've hardly ever seen that before. But him struggling with this internal conflict makes him slightly more relatable compared to these all good heroes that we see, and it also makes him slightly less likable, but that's just my take. So this episode is a 7 out of 10, but it gets a 6 because of those damn Sequids. We head back to Viltrum where we see a young Nolan who just happens to look so much like Mark getting brutally attacked by his own parents. Because tough love. And then we see the outbreak of the Scourge virus which pretty much kills most of the planet, and we find out that Nolan is recounting this to Alan whilst they're escaping from Viltrum and heading towards Telestria. Nolan is also having this internal battle between his Viltrumite self and his more human side and his care for Mark and Oliver. Once on Telestria, Nolan meets with Thaddeus and he finds out he was the betrayer, and Nolan and Alan set out to find the characters in Nolan's books to help fight the Viltrum Empire. However, on the journey there, this happens, and it happens a lot. They then manage to recruit Space Racer, the Ragnars, and Battle Beast too, and also meet the Geldarians who tell them to seek out Tech Jacket who's on Earth. Thaddeus also suggests to Nolan to get the help of Mark when they travel to Earth, but Nolan initially refuses. Then Thaddeus shows Nolan the Scourge virus and reveals that he was the one that released it into the atmosphere of Viltrum, hoping it will allow Nolan to trust him. But Nolan crashes out, because pretty much most of his race got wiped out from that virus. But in order to not use the virus again, Nolan agrees to recruit Mark to help fight. Then Conquest returns to Viltrum and we see the arrival of Thrag. This episode is probably the best of the season premiere because it shows a lot more of Nolan's backstory and then progresses the story a lot further, because throughout the previous seasons we've been getting small snippets of what's to come next, but we haven't actually got a full-on proper episode or a full arc focusing on this, and it's finally nice to see this. And since Mark isn't holding back, it's also good to see the Viltrumite conflict coming into full flow. Also seeing Nolan having this internal conflict within him where he's basically pissed off that they just wiped out the entire Viltrum race besides a few, but also him realizing that the Viltrumites are bad and they should have gone is interesting, and that's also a running theme throughout the season. I also do like this new angle of Nolan where he's not completely redeemed, but he's slowly redeeming himself by fighting against the Viltrumites, and so this episode gets an 8 out of 10. Cecil and Donald are kinda scared that Mark might actually snap and just basically slime everyone, because he's been sliming a lot of people recently, but they still believe he has some good in him, so he won't cross that line just yet. Meanwhile, Titan returns and so does Machine Head, and Mr. Lou the Dragon is still alive. Titan then asks for Invincible Inc.'s help to deal with Mr. Lou the Dragon, but Oliver goes instead because he wants a job.
How much does this job pay?
Mark is feeling pretty bad about sliming Russ, and Cecil even offers a word of advice, telling him to let him be the one who deals with who gets to live or die, because that's too much burden for one person and that kind of decision can change the person forever. Rudy also finds out he has a sequid inside of him. Can we stop with the sequids? I swear, please. I've had enough. And Monster Girl finds out. The Flaxens then return and start causing havoc, and the Guardians and the Mark step in to stop them from taking over. They seem to have the upper hand as they aren't aging as fast as they did before. Rudy then finds out this is because they have an emitter located on their side of the portal, so he hops through it with Monster Girl and destroy the emitter, but the Flaxens realize this and close the portal, trapping behind Robot and Monster Girl. Finally, the fraud that took my goat's name is gone. For now, but still I will celebrate. It also turns out that Oliver couldn't deal with Mr. Lou, so Mark steps in and basically beats up Mr. Lou and Titan. Also, what is Oliver doing in the show? He probably has like one win this season against the Mauler twins, and that's only because they weren't expecting him to slime them. But anyway, Mark also beats up Titan, so Titan rejoins the order, and we find out that Eve is actually pregnant. Purely because Robot is gone, this episode gets a 9 out of 10, because this clanker not only had the audacity of stealing my goat's appearance, but also decides to steal his name in his funeral as a tribute to him. But you will never be Rex, Rudy. Okay, Robot rant aside, this is a pretty solid episode. Unlike the Sequids, I do like the Flaxens, so bring me more of the Flaxens. Replace everything with the Sequids with the Flaxens. They're pretty cool, and the fact that they age really quickly is pretty interesting to see. And again, this episode spends a lot of time exploring Mark's internal conflict of whether or not he should slime people, and it's pretty interesting. But because they dropped all three at the same time, it doesn't feel like it's repetitive, that's happening week to week. Which is a good thing, because I would have got bored if this happened every week. Also, the stuff with Titan is kind of boring. Like, don't get me wrong, he's a cool character and he kind of had a good endpoint where he just sort of does his own thing away from his daughter and he isn't going to bother Mark and the others again. But bringing him back was kind of pointless because this just sets everything that we had over the past 3 seasons back to square one. And so therefore he's back in the order and he's against Mark again, which is weird and odd. So yeah, this episode gets a 7 out of 10. Remember Damien Darkblood? And that post-credit scene we had in the finale of season 3? Well, here it is. Volcanica is basically taking over the Underrealm, and Damien and his sister Domina are basically getting cooked by her, so Damien comes up with a genius idea of summoning Omni-Man to the Underrealm to help fight. But since he was exercised, he doesn't realize that Nolan is sleeping with his ears covered in the middle of space, so instead the spell summons Mark, who was midway through fighting Cahor, who was finally about to make Mark his host. So instead he takes a female host. Also Satan is there, and he's voiced by Bruce Campbell. They then explain that the demons kinda need to keep the universe balanced, but Volcanica is disrupting this balance, so they need to stop her, and Mark agrees. So they fall for about 5 minutes and then stop Volcanica. And Mark heads back, and Damien is also sent back to spy on Volcanica and to return again another day. Mark then decides to wear a new suit with his old color scheme because he realizes that he doesn't want to slime people anymore, and also because he suffered a bit too much in that suit. Also, Eve tells William of all people that she's pregnant, and Nolan has finally arrived to Earth because he needs Mark's help. First off, this isn't a proper filler episode. Like, yes, it doesn't focus on the main story of the season and it isn't in the comics, but the fact that Damien will return at some point in the future makes this not filler, and therefore I quite like this episode. And to be honest, everything in this season is so packed and intense, and having this slow episode does feel kind of refreshing, though I don't appreciate the lore bombing that happens in this episode. Nevertheless, this was kind of fun, and this was the complete opposite of what I thought would happen when that post-credit scene came out in season 3. Still, this episode is a 7 out of 10. Nolan explains that the real reason he was sent to Earth was to see if humanity was compatible with Viltrumite DNA, and if so, they can repopulate the Viltrum Empire. And obviously, Mark is still kind of annoyed. Then we get the long-awaited reunion of Nolan and Debbie, except it didn't go the way Nolan planned. He thought that by simply apologizing to her for lying and calling her his pet, she might forgive him, but the exact opposite happens and she's kind of super pissed at him. She even punches him and breaks her wrist. Tech Jacket is fighting the Walking Dead when she gets summoned to join the fight against the Viltrumites. Oliver is super pissed that Nolan just aired him and didn't even speak to him and refuses to acknowledge his existence, but wants to join in on the fight against the Viltrums because for some reason he still thinks that he stands a chance, and reluctantly both Mark and Debbie agree. They then aboard the ship and get ambushed by the Viltrumites, and then the Viltrumite war begins. There's a whole bunch of fights, and Oliver almost gets bodied by Conquest again, but Mark steps in to fight Conquest. Meanwhile, the rest are also fighting the Viltrumites to various degrees of effect, but the main fight that we all care about is the rematch between Mark and Conquest, where Conquest rips out Mark's guts and everything inside of him, but Mark somehow still continues the fight until Mark suffocates Conquest and he dies for good. This time, we hope. Cecil, don't come anywhere near this place, I swear to God. Oliver and Nolan find Mark on the floor of this planet with his guts spilt literally everywhere, and they go to help him, and Alan and Tech Jacket are playing video games as they wait to escape the Viltrumite ship. Now you're gonna start seeing a trend with all future episodes, so bear with me. Last episode there was nothing happening, so this episode a bunch of stuff happens. But I have to say, all of the stuff that does happen is absolute peak. And if there's any awards for voice acting, please give it to Sandra Oh, because that scene with Debbie just breaking down in front of Nolan is amazing. And it's probably the best written scene in the entire season. And it was absolutely genius. And it's so nice to finally see her release all of that pain and anger that was inside of her over the past 2 seasons. We also have Nolan trying to repair the relationships that he had ruined by, deciding to turn bad. He feels remorse for his actions, but at the same time, he can see why the Viltrumites had to do it. And it's just kind of amazing to see this conflict. Also, the animators lock in when it comes to Mark versus Conquest, because that fight scene was amazing. And purely for that reason, but also the entire episode being good, it's a 9 out of 10. The Viltrumite war is now in full flow with both sides planning attacks. Meanwhile, Mark is still healing from getting his guts ripped out by Conquest, and is being taken care of by Nolan and Oliver. Nolan has also made a Viltrumite memorial for Conquest, since at the end of the day, they were once besties. Months go by as the war progresses, and we see Alan and Tech Jacket return to Telescria. Nolan grows a beard, and so does Oliver, if you can even call it that, and they start bonding and getting closer. The reason Oliver was always so mad at him was because Nolan basically treated him like he was a mistake and wasn't really his son. And also he had overheard him talking about his real mum being a mistake to Debbie, his other mum. And after this, they kinda get close and start working together. Mark then finally wakes up, but he sees Conquest's grave and thinks that Nolan and Oliver are dead. Then the Viltrumites begin invading Telescria and a huge fight ensues, and we even see Theda's fight. Mark, Nolan and Oliver also join, and the heroes finally get a win in this war as the Viltrumites retreat. Again, after an action-packed episode last episode, say it with me, it's a slow episode. I do wish we saw more in this episode. Now, I'm not saying what we got was bad, it's just I wish we saw more. And I'll talk about what I mean in the overall review. But that conversation with Nolan and Oliver is amazing, because that heart-to-heart is basically all they needed to finally repair their relationship. And maybe that's what Nolan needs with everyone else. Except for the people of Earth, I don't think they're gonna forgive him for what he did. That last fight scene was pretty cool, though Thrag is a fraud for now. So this episode gets a 7.5 out of 10. We see some Relonians revolt against their Viltrumite oppressors, and the Emperor Argo holds an emergency meeting to see what they can do. Here we see that Theda says that they should be less cruel towards those who are in the Empire. Maybe they might like them more. And honestly, a genius idea if you ask me. But Regent Thrag suggests that they should educate them on true Viltrumite strength, and Emperor Argo orders them to wipe out 25% of the entire population. Thrag and Argo talk about Thedas' defiant act, and he orders Thrag to deal with them. However, before Thrag can do anything, Thedas assassinates Argo. And at Argo's funeral, Thrag takes control of power as Grand Regent, and in his speech he basically tells everyone to slime each other, and this leads to the Great Purge. Then in the present, Thedas and Co decide to attack the Viltrumites head on and fly out to Viltrum, and we also see a recreation of this epic panel. Once they arrive on Viltrum, they see Thrag already there waiting for them, along with the remaining Viltrumites, and this of course leads to a huge fight. But Thrag finally starts fighting back, and he actually cooks. Tech Jacket also has the Scourge virus, and she starts shooting it into the Viltrumites, allowing Alan to basically one-shot them. In between the fight, Thrag tries to convince Nolan to return to the Viltrumite cause and make him question Thedas' loyalty on whether or not, if given the chance, Thedas will slime the remaining Viltrumites, including Mark and Oliver. But since Thrag wasn't willing to reason, and Oliver got his jaw broken and arm ripped off by Thrag, and also none of Mark's punches were landing, Nolan decides to assemble the crew and destroy Viltrum, which they do. Then Thrag and all the remaining Viltrumites freak out, and he slimes Thedas and slowly plans on torturing and sliming Mark and Nolan, but stops after realizing that they need to repopulate and head to Earth. Then Mark recovers, and Oliver's in a healing tube just like Goku on Namek, and you just know he's gonna cook like Goku did on Namek. And Alan is now the leader of the coalition after Thedas' death. And I must say, Thrag is so cool. Like, the fact that he basically has Ultra Instinct on point 24/7 is insane. He's so badass, and I'm so sorry for ever doubting that man. And those impact frames and just that entire sequence was amazing. And then when he gets angry and just rips them apart is also pretty cool. But the fact that Thrag is this strong, which does make me question if Mark, Oliver and Nolan have sort of barely won a fight without almost dying, how on earth have they won this war? Like, how is that even physically possible? Like, I guess them destroying Viltrum was the winning point, but at the same time this has to be so much plot armor, because like, how? But Oliver is about to go Super Saiyan next season, I can feel it, and he's about to cook everyone, and everyone who's been saying Oliver's a fraud, including myself, is about to shut up. Also, Thaddeus was starting to get on my nerves because he's basically manipulating the good Viltrumites and doesn't seem to trust them despite being a Viltrumite himself and wants to get rid of the Viltrumites, but he wants to get rid of all of them besides himself. Yeah, this guy's a bit odd, and it's so good that he's dead. Also, Zoe absolutely cooks this episode with that gun which shoots the Scourge virus into people, and it instantly nerfs all of the Viltrumites, and why weren't they using it throughout the entire war? So for that reason, this episode gets an 8 out of 10. Mark realizes and starts freaking out that the remaining Viltrumites are all headed towards Earth, and so Nolan, Mark and Zoe rush back to Earth to see the complete and utter carnage caused by the Viltrumites, except nothing like that happened. Instead, Mark finds a perfectly alive Debbie and tells her about Oliver. Nolan also has another awkward reunion with Debbie. Mark then finds Eve and they get busy straight away, and since Mark had left, she moved back with her parents to take care of them, and she hasn't been using her powers too much. Cecil, the ultra mega genius that he is, decides to open a portal to the Flaxen dimension to bring back Robot and Monster Girl, but instead it opens a portal to a tentacle beast. Mark also meets with William and Rick, and since returning to Earth, he's been dealing with these PTSD episodes where he would hallucinate that the Viltrumites are brutally ripping apart everyone on Earth, and it turns out that two of Earth's greatest defenders have broken up. What will we ever do? And Paul convinces Debbie that she should go to space and take care of Oliver herself. Eve also reveals to Mark that she had an abortion because she was unsure if Mark will ever return, and didn't want to take care of a child on her own. Nolan then heads to the place where he told Mark to think, and Cecil gets an alert and goes there and basically tells him to leave. Mark also informs Cecil about the Viltrumites and that they might be coming for Earth, but not before he suffers another episode. Eve then tells Mark to fly around to help clear his mind, but there he flies into Thrag. For real this time, and he tries to fight him but realizes he stands no chance. But it turns out that Thrag was offering a truce. The Viltrumites will stay on Earth and breed to grow their population and won't interfere with any human affairs if Mark promises to leave them alone. And with no other option, Mark accepts. And also Thaddeus has given a stronger version of the Scourge virus to use on all the remaining Viltrumites, including Mark, Nolan and Oliver. Now, this is a pretty slow finale, and compared to the other finales we had over the past few seasons, this is probably the worst, though I'd argue the season 2 finale is there, but the fact that we do kinda get a Spider-Man cameo does shoot it up a bit. But after the entire season just focusing purely on the Viltrumite war, this is a much needed sort of breath of fresh air really, whilst also setting up the future story. But the fact that this is a bad finale doesn't mean that this is a bad episode. It just means that compared to all of the other finales, it's just not as good. But this is by far not the worst episode of Invincible. And I did quite enjoy this episode a lot more than some of the other episodes this season, and so this episode gets an 8.5 out of 10. Overall, this season is good, there's no denying that. However, I do have some mixed thoughts about this, because everyone seems to be hyping up this season like it's the best season of Invincible so far, and yet for me, this didn't seem to live up to that hype. And it might just be because we've been getting fed non-stop with content, especially with The Boys, Daredevil, Born Again and more Shadow Legends, or it might just be because the entire season seems to focus on the Viltrumite war and it might have just got stale, and the adrenaline and the hype that was there at the start just wasn't there towards the end of the season. Like, I do wish that there was some cutaway of like the Coalition freeing some planets, or Debbie worrying about Mark and Oliver on Earth, or Amber moving back in with her parents like she says that happens, because this would have been nice to see and it would have shown us more of the universal impact this war is having. Because at the end of the day, this is about the coalition of planets freeing the planets under the Viltrum control, and yet we don't really seem to see any sort of planet being freed. Over the past seasons, we've seen Mark being guilt tripped over all of the past fights that have happened and all of the victims that have come from it. So it would have been nice for Mark to have seen sort of the good side of the war, where all of these planets are being freed, and instead the show just sort of completely pushes that aside. And also the pacing of the season does feel a bit off. Like, the previous seasons had pacing on point, so even if the story wasn't that good for an episode, the pacing of that episode is still good, where you wouldn't feel like you're being crammed with loads of stuff. Whereas in this season, you would have an episode filled with action and information and all of this stuff, whereas the next episode is quite slow. And this happens throughout the season, and it sort of gets tiring towards the end, because episode 7 was a good episode, but I was sort of exhausted because of just the amount of stuff that happens in that episode. Like, episode 5 could have easily been split into 2 episodes, where episode 5 could have ended with the Viltrumites ambushing Mark and the gang, and then the next episode could have focused on the rematch between Mark and Conquest. Now I do understand that the animation team is understaffed, and so they probably don't want to animate an entire fight scene for a whole episode. And honestly, Amazon, if you're willing to spend millions on just hiring voice actors, you might as well just hire a few other people to just, fix the pacing. And let's be real, none of the audience would be complaining if we got an entire episode of Mark vs. Conquest, because that was literally the finale of season 3, and that's like one of the highest rated episodes of the season. And so instead, this entire season just felt like they were cramming stuff in just so they can fit the war into one season, and they didn't have to do that. And I'd much rather they've taken their time and sort of explored different sections of the war. So for that reason, this gets an 8 out of 10. Now do comment below your thoughts and subscribe whilst you're there.